The message from my son arrived at 8:17 on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before Christmas. I remember the time because I was standing at my workbench with a piece of walnut underneath my left hand, and I'd just finished sanding one of the corners smooth. I'd spent 3 mornings working on that piece. It was going to become the backrest of a rocking chair for my youngest granddaughter. My phone buzzed against the wooden bench. I wiped the dust from my fingers and picked it up. The message was from Daniel, my son. I expected him to ask what time I was coming over that weekend, or maybe whether I'd found the old Christmas lights he wanted for the porch. Instead, I read the message once, then twice, because I couldn't quite believe what I was looking at. Dad, please don't come to Christmas this year. Claire wants to host, and she thinks it would be better if we kept it small. We'll see you after the holidays. Please don't make this difficult. I stood there in my workshop with the phone in my hand. For a few seconds, I actually wondered if there was another Raymond in the family. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny. Sometimes you laugh when something hurts so badly that your mind doesn't know what else to do. I called him. He answered on the fourth ring. "Hey, Dad." I said, "What's this message?" There was a pause. "I knew you'd call. That's why you sent it." Another pause. Then he said, "Claire's hosting this year." I wasn't asking where Christmas was. He sighed. "Dad, she's my wife." I looked around my workshop. On the wall was a photograph of Daniel at 8 years old, standing beside the first piece of furniture I'd ever made specifically for him. In the corner was the wooden sled my father had built for me when I was a boy. I said, "Daniel, did you really think I'd spend Christmas alone so your wife could feel like she finally had the family she wanted?" He didn't answer. And then, from somewhere in the background, I heard Claire say something. I couldn't make out the words. Daniel lowered his voice. "Dad, there's something else you need to know about Grandpa's house." My stomach tightened. "What about Grandpa's house?" He hesitated. Then he said, "Claire found the will." I stopped breathing for a moment. Why was Claire looking for Grandpa's will? Daniel didn't answer. And that's when I realized Christmas wasn't really the problem. Christmas was just the beginning. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever been made to feel like an outsider by your own family, hit like and subscribe. Because what happened to me that Christmas taught me something I wish I'd understood much earlier in life. Sometimes the people who are trying hardest to push you out of the family have no idea how much you know. And sometimes they don't realize that the person they're underestimating has been quietly protecting something they desperately want.
My name is Raymond Ashcroft. I'm 73 years old, and for almost 50 years I was a carpenter. I started working with wood when I was 24. My father had been a carpenter before me, although he always insisted I call it a trade, rather than a family tradition. He used to say that calling something a tradition made young people think they were entitled to inherit it. A trade, he said, had to be earned every morning. So I earned it. I built kitchen cabinets, staircases, dining tables, bookshelves, doors, porches, cabinets, and once, an entire set of church pews that took me nearly 6 months. I never became rich, but I made enough to raise 2 children, pay the mortgage, put money aside for retirement, and keep a little house outside Harrisburg that my grandfather had once called the most important place in our family. That house was not a mansion. It wasn't even particularly impressive from the road. It had faded gray siding, a stone chimney, a porch that needed repainting every few years, and an old maple tree in the front yard that my grandfather had planted before I was born. But inside, the house held almost 70 years of our family's life. My daughter Emily had taken her first steps there. My son Daniel had broken his arm jumping from the porch. My wife Margaret had baked hundreds of Christmas cookies in the kitchen. And every December, no matter what had happened during the year, we gathered around the long dining table my grandfather had made. I thought that tradition was permanent. At 73, I've learned that almost nothing is permanent, especially not family traditions. Daniel had always been my quieter child. Emily said what she thought. Daniel thought about what he wanted to say before saying it. When he was young, he would follow me around the workshop, and watch me work. He didn't have much patience for sanding. He loved the power tools. I remember him standing beside me when he was about 10, watching a board pass through the planer. "How do you know how much to take off?" he asked. "You measure." "What if you don't measure?" "You ruin the board." He thought about that. Then he asked, "What if you make a mistake?" I told him. "Then you figure out how to fix it." I didn't realize until much later that those were probably the most important lessons I ever gave him. Daniel married Laura when he was 28. Laura was a good woman. They weren't perfect, but they were happy for a long time. They had 2 children. For 17 years, Laura sat around our Christmas table. She knew where I kept the extra plates. She knew which cupboard held the good glasses. She knew that Margaret hated wrapping presents and always left it until Christmas Eve. Then the marriage fell apart. I never learned every detail, and I didn't want to. There's some things a father doesn't need to know about his adult son's marriage. I helped Daniel move into an apartment. I stored his furniture. I watched the grandchildren when he needed somewhere to leave them. But I never told him Laura was wrong. And I never told Laura Daniel was wrong. I simply tried to remain his father. About a year after the divorce, Daniel met Claire. And that's when things began changing. The first time I met Claire, she arrived at my house carrying a bottle of expensive wine and a small notebook. I remember the notebook because I thought it was unusual. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked questions. A lot of questions. How long had I owned the house? What did my grandfather do? Was the property still in my name? How much land was behind the house? Did Daniel have any claim to it? I answered politely. When she asked whether Daniel had any claim to the property, I smiled and said, "No, the house is mine." She nodded. Then she smiled. Of course. There was something about the way she said it that bothered me. Not enough to confront her, just enough to remember. After Daniel married her, Claire became involved in everything. At first, I welcomed it. I thought maybe she was trying to become part of the family. Then small things started changing. The first Christmas she hosted, she removed the handmade ornaments from the tree. When I asked where they were, she said, "I put them away. They don't really fit the look." I looked at the tree. Everything was white and silver. "What's wrong with the old ornaments?" She smiled. "Nothing. I just want something more elegant." I nodded. Sure. That was the first time I realized something. Claire didn't want to join our traditions. She wanted to replace them. A few months later, Daniel and Claire came to my house for dinner. While I was grilling outside, Claire walked through the dining room. She stopped beside the old table. "This is original, right?" "Yes." "How old?" "Almost 50 years. She ran her fingers along the edge. "Do you know what something like this would sell for today?" I laughed. "Probably less than what I spent making it." She didn't laugh. Instead, she pulled out her phone and took a picture. "Claire, what? Why are you photographing my table?" "It's beautiful." I shrugged. Then she asked, "Have you ever thought about renovating this place?" I looked toward the kitchen. "I've renovated plenty of it." "No, I mean properly." I smiled. "I am a carpenter." "I know." She looked around. "I just think it could be incredible." Daniel was sitting in the living room. I called toward him. "Your wife thinks my house needs saving." He laughed. Claire didn't. A few minutes later, I noticed something else. She had a laser measuring device. She was measuring the wall between the dining room and kitchen. I watched her quietly. "What are you measuring?" "Just space." "Why?" She smiled. "Just curious." I didn't think much of it at the time. I should have. Over the next year, Daniel changed. Not dramatically. That's the problem. If he had suddenly stopped speaking to me, I would have noticed. Instead, the calls became shorter. Sunday dinners became monthly dinners. Monthly dinners became occasional visits. And eventually, I started hearing about family plans after they had already happened. One afternoon, Emily came into my workshop. She stood in the doorway while I was repairing an old rocking chair. "Dad, yeah, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What's happening with Daniel?" I kept working. "What do you mean?" "He barely talks to you." "He's busy." "Dad, he's not that busy." I looked at her. She folded her arms. "Claire doesn't like you." I laughed. "That's a little dramatic." "No, it's true." I put the screwdriver down. Why? Emily shrugged. Because you're his father. I didn't understand. She continued. She thinks you're too involved in his life. I barely see him. I know. That was the part that hurt. I'd spent my whole life trying not to interfere, and somehow I'd still become interference. The biggest change happened when Daniel and Claire bought their new house. They invited me over. Claire gave me a tour. It was beautiful. New floors, huge kitchen, modern cabinets, large windows. Everything looked expensive and clean. Claire walked me into the living room. We want to host Christmas here. I smiled. That's wonderful. She looked at Daniel, then back at me. We think it's time for a fresh start. I said, a fresh start? She nodded. New family traditions. Daniel looked uncomfortable. I didn't challenge her. I simply said, sounds nice. On the drive home, I realized something. For the first time in 45 years, I didn't know where Christmas was going to be. And that bothered me more than I expected. Not because of the house. Because I was beginning to understand that my role in my son's life was changing. And I wasn't sure if that change was happening naturally, or if someone was pushing me out. 6 months before Christmas, Daniel and Claire visited my house again. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard Claire upstairs. I walked down the hallway. She was standing in the dining room with the laser measuring device. What are you doing? She turned. Nothing. I looked at the wall. Then at her. You're measuring the room. I like the proportions. For what? She smiled. Possibilities. Daniel walked in. Claire. What? Stop. She rolled her eyes. I was just looking. I looked at my son. What's going on? Nothing. Daniel. He lowered his voice. Dad, can we not do this? Do what? Turn everything into a confrontation. I stared at him. I asked what your wife was doing in my dining room with the laser measuring tool. Claire walked past me. You know what, Raymond? Forget it. She went outside. Daniel followed her. I stood alone in the dining room, and for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt since my children were young. Fear. Not fear that I would lose my house. Fear that I was about to lose my son. 3 months before Christmas, Daniel called me. Dad, we're hosting Christmas this year. I smiled. Okay. Claire wants it at our place. That's fine. She wants it smaller. I paused. What does that mean? Immediate family. I said, I'm your father. I know. So am I invited? He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, of course. I believed him. That was my mistake. 2 weeks later, Claire sent a group message. We're excited to host our first real Christmas. We'd like to keep it intimate this year. Just the kids, Daniel and me. We'll do something with everyone else after Christmas. I read it. Emily called me 5 minutes later. Did you get that? Yes. Dad, I'm fine. Are you? I looked at the Christmas tree in my living room. Yes, but I wasn't. Because there are certain sentences that don't need to say your name to make you understand that they're about you. 3 weeks later came the message from Daniel. The one that started everything. Dad, please don't come to Christmas this year. Claire wants to host, and she thinks it would be better if we kept it small. We'll see you after the holidays. Please don't make this difficult. I didn't respond for nearly an hour. Then I wrote, okay. Deleted it. Wrote, understood. Deleted that too. Finally I sent, I understand. That was all. Then I went back to my workbench. I picked up the walnut, and I realized my hand was shaking. I had built furniture for almost 50 years. I cut my fingers, broken bones, worked through fever, worked through grief. But nothing had ever made my hands shake like a text message from my son. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 1 in the morning, I went upstairs. I don't know why. Maybe instinct. Maybe memory. Maybe my grandfather had been waiting 25 years for me to finally understand. I opened the old hallway cabinet. Inside was the drawer I'd forgotten about. I found the brass key. The drawer opened with a dry wooden scrape. There were old receipts, property records, photographs, letters, and one envelope. My grandfather's handwriting was on it. For Raymond, open when the family forgets what this place means. I sat on the floor. I almost didn't open it. Then I did. Inside was a copy of his will. I read it slowly. Then I read it again. The house belonged to me, but there was a trust attached to the property. The house could not simply be sold for profit. It could not be divided. It could not be transferred to someone who intended to turn it into an investment property. My grandfather had also established a condition that if no direct descendant was willing to preserve the house as a family home, ownership would eventually pass to a Veterans Housing Foundation. Then I found the handwritten letter, and that's where everything changed. My grandfather had written, "Raymond, if you are reading this, something has probably gone wrong." I smiled sadly. Even dead, the man knew our family. He continued, "People will tell you that a house is worth whatever someone is willing to pay for it. They are wrong. A house is worth whatever memories it protects." I stopped reading, then continued, "One day, someone may want to sell this place. Someone may want to tear down the kitchen, remove the fireplace, divide the land, or turn the dining room into something fashionable. Don't fight them because you are sentimental. Fight them because you promised to protect what this house represents." I stared at those words. Then came the sentence that broke me. Your responsibility is not to keep the family together. Your responsibility is to protect the place where the family can choose to come together. I put the letter down. I had spent my entire life thinking family meant keeping everyone happy. My grandfather had understood something I hadn't. You can't force people to love each other. You can only keep the door open. The next morning, Daniel called me. "Dad." "Yes." "Claire found out about the will." I figured. "She says you hid it." "I didn't know about the full document until last night." He was silent. Then I asked, "What were you planning to do with the house?" Another silence. "Daniel." Finally he said, "She wanted to renovate." "How much?" "I don't know." "Daniel." "About $400,000. I closed my eyes. $400,000? She wanted to open the kitchen, remove the fireplace, redo the upstairs, and maybe build onto the back. I looked toward the fireplace. My grandfather had sat beside it every Christmas. My father had sat there. My wife had sat there. My children had sat there. And Claire wanted it gone. I asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel said, "Because I thought eventually you'd give it to us." That sentence hurt more than anything else. Not because he wanted the house. Because somewhere along the way, my son had started thinking my possessions were his future, and I had allowed him to believe that. Christmas Eve came. I stayed home. Emily came over with a pie. We sat in the kitchen. She asked me if I was angry. I said yes. She asked if I hated Daniel. I said no. Then she asked the hardest question. "Do you think he'll come back?" I looked at the Christmas tree. I don't know. Around 9 that night, someone knocked. I opened the door. Daniel was standing outside. No Claire. No coat. Snow on his shoulders. He looked exhausted. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. He entered. For several seconds, he didn't speak. Then he said, "Dad, I'm sorry." I didn't answer. He looked around the house. "I haven't been here in months." "No." I didn't realize how much I'd missed it. I said, "You didn't miss the house." He looked at me. "You missed what it meant." He nodded. Then he said something I never expected. "I think I let someone convince me that loving my father meant choosing between him and my wife." I looked at him, and he swallowed. I was wrong. Christmas morning, Claire came with Daniel. She carried a folder. She placed it on my kitchen table. "We need to talk." I said, "About the house?" "Yes." She opened the folder. There were architectural drawings. I looked at them. My kitchen was gone. The fireplace was gone. The dining room was gone. The porch was enclosed. The upstairs bedrooms had been turned into one enormous master suite. I looked at her. "You've already designed it." She nodded. "We were trying to build something for the future." I said, "You were trying to build a future without me." She became defensive. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Daniel said nothing. Claire looked at him. "Tell him." Daniel remained silent. "What?" I asked. Claire finally said, "We thought you would eventually give the house to Daniel." I looked at my son. "Did you?" He looked down. "Yes." I nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me the truth." Claire said, "You don't understand. We have children. We need stability." I said, "Then build stability." She stared at me. "Why are you making this so difficult?" And that's when I finally answered the question she had been asking for years. "I'm not. I picked up the will. You're trying to make something mine become yours. I placed it on the table, and now you're angry because you discovered it was never yours." Claire read the document. Her face changed. Daniel read it next. He sat down. "Grandpa really did this?" "Yes." Claire looked at me. "You could lose the house." "Eventually." "To a veterans organization?" "Yes." "So nobody gets it?" I shook my head. "That's not what it says." I pointed to the final section. "It stays in the family if the family is willing to preserve it." Daniel looked at me. "What does that mean?" "It means the house belongs to someone who understands what it is." Claire laughed bitterly. "And who decides that?" I looked at her. "My grandfather already did." Silence filled the room. Then Daniel said, "I think I know what he meant." Claire looked at him. "Daniel." He shook his head. "No." "What?" "I can't do this anymore." She stared at him. "You choose him over me?" Daniel looked at her. "This isn't about choosing Dad." He paused. "It's about whether we become the kind of people Grandpa was warning him about." Claire left. Daniel stayed. We sat at the kitchen table for almost an hour, without saying much. Eventually he said, "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Do you hate her?" I thought about it. "No." "Why?" "Because hate takes too much energy." He laughed quietly. "You're still my dad." "I hope so." He looked around. "Can I come back?" I said. "The door was never locked." He smiled. "But things won't be the same." "No. I know. We'll have to build something new." He nodded. And that was the first honest conversation we'd had in years. The months after Christmas were complicated. There was no magical transformation. That's not how families work. Daniel and Claire went through counseling. Emily remained cautious. I stopped trying to solve everyone's problems. That was harder than I expected. For decades, whenever something went wrong, I'd fixed it. Broken chair? Fix it. Broken window? Fix it. Argument? Call everyone. Someone needs money? Help them. Someone doesn't like someone else? Find common ground. But eventually I realized that constantly repairing other people's problems can prevent them from learning how to repair their own. So I stepped back. Daniel had to make his choices. Claire had to make hers. And I had to make mine. Claire came back in October. She stood on my porch holding the brass candle holder, the one she had taken from the table at Christmas. "I brought this back." I took it. "Thank you." She looked at the house. "You repaired the porch." "Yes. It looks good." "Thank you." She was quiet. Then she said, "I owe you an apology." I waited. I thought I had to replace everything that came before me. She looked through the window. I thought if the house looked like mine, I'd finally feel like I belonged. I said, "You could have belonged without destroying anything." She nodded. "I know that now." Then she asked, "Do you still want us at Christmas?" I looked at her. "Do you want to come?" She nodded. "Yes." "Then come." She started crying. I didn't hug her immediately. Then I did. Not because everything was forgiven, but because sometimes forgiveness begins with allowing someone to put the weapon down. The following Christmas wasn't perfect. It was better. Daniel arrived early. Emily brought 3 pies. The grandchildren decorated the tree. Someone broke a glass. Someone burned the rolls. Someone argued about politics. Someone laughed so hard they started coughing. In other words, it was Christmas again. Claire stood in the kitchen making mashed potatoes. At one point, she came into the dining room. She looked at the old table. "Raymond." "Yes." "What's this scratch?" I smiled. "Daniel." Daniel looked over. "Hey." She laughed. "How old were you?" 8. "What did you do?" I carved my initials. Claire looked at him. "Your father kept it all these years." I said, "Of course." She ran her fingers across the scratch, and for the first time, she didn't see damage. She saw history. A few days after Christmas, I went upstairs and opened my grandfather's drawer again. I reread his letter. I'd read it many times by then. But one sentence suddenly felt different. You cannot carry a family by yourself. I sat there thinking about my life. I'd spent decades believing a good father was the person who always showed up, the person who paid, the person who forgave, the person who fixed, the person who kept quiet, the person who made everyone comfortable. But that's not what a good father is. A good father can love his children without surrendering his dignity. A good father can forgive without pretending something never happened. A good father can say no. And sometimes the hardest form of love is allowing your adult children to experience the consequences of their choices. That Christmas, I finally understood something. I had spent too many years trying to make sure everyone had a seat at my table. I had forgotten that they had to choose whether they wanted to sit there. Do you remember the piece of walnut I was working on when Daniel sent me that message? The rocking chair? I finished it. It took me another month. I gave it to my youngest granddaughter. When she sat in it for the first time, she looked at me and said, "Grandpa, did you make this?" I said, "Yes." She smiled. "Can you make me another one?" I laughed. "Why?" "So I can have one at my house." I looked at her. "Maybe." Then she asked, "Are you going to teach me?" I looked at her little hands, and I remembered my grandfather teaching me. I remembered Daniel standing beside my workbench when he was 8. I remembered telling him, "You measure. What if you make a mistake? You figure out how to fix it." I realized then that maybe the most important things we leave our children aren't houses. They're habits, stories, skills, memories, the way we treat people, the things we refuse to compromise, the examples we set when nobody is watching. That's the inheritance that survives us. I'm 73 years old. My hands are slower now. I don't build houses anymore. I don't take big jobs. But every December, I still go into the workshop. I still smell the cedar. I still keep my grandfather's tools on the wall. And I still make one wooden ornament for every grandchild. This year I made one for Claire. It was a small Christmas tree. On the back I carved 4 words. "You belong here too." When she opened it, she looked at me. She didn't say anything. She just hugged me. And I realized that the Christmas I thought had been taken from me had actually given me something. It forced me to stop pretending everything was okay. It forced my son to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. It forced Claire to understand that belonging doesn't require erasing someone else's history. And it forced me to finally understand my own worth. For most of my life, I thought family meant keeping the door open no matter what. I don't believe that anymore. Family isn't simply the people who share your blood. It's the people who respect your heart. The people who show up when there is nothing to gain. The people who don't measure your value by what you own. The people who don't make you feel disposable because someone new has entered their life. And if you're older, maybe you've experienced something similar. Maybe your children don't call as often anymore. Maybe someone married into your family, and suddenly everything changed. Maybe you've spent years giving and giving until one day you realized nobody was asking what you wanted. If that's you, I want you to remember something. You can love your family without abandoning yourself. You can forgive someone without giving them unlimited access to your life. You can leave the door open without standing in the doorway, waiting for someone to walk through it. And you don't have to become bitter just because someone treated you badly. Sometimes dignity is simply saying, "I love you, but I will not allow you to treat me this way." My grandfather left me a house, but that wasn't his greatest gift. His greatest gift was teaching me that a home isn't something you possess. It's something you protect. And family isn't something you control. It's something you build, board by board, choice by choice, year after year. And sometimes, when the people you love push you out of the room, you discover that you were never the one who didn't belong. You were simply the one who had forgotten your worth. So, if this story meant something to you, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever had to stand up to family who underestimated you, subscribe. Because there are some lessons we don't learn when we're young. We learn them when we're old enough to understand what really matters. And sometimes, the greatest inheritance isn't the house someone leaves you. It's the wisdom to know when to open the door and when to finally close it.